You have been sold a comfortable lie about modern Britain. The conventional wisdom, carefully curated by politicians and reflected in mainstream media, is that the United Kingdom is a 21st century economic superpower, a beacon of development. This narrative paints a picture of isolated problems being managed, of social evolution, of progress, but the data, when you choose to look, tells a very different story. While the glass towers of London and the heritage sites attract the tourist cameras, a vast, silent transformation is occurring beneath the surface. You cannot simply look at the headline GDP and assume national health. What we are witnessing is not evolution, but a quiet structural atrophy. We were told that the squalid, dangerous living conditions of the 1800s were a dark chapter forever closed by social reform. The modern United Kingdom, however, is witnessing a relentless decay that is reviving those very conditions. This isn't dramatic. It's slow, wet, and poisonous. You see it in the properties that are outwardly indistinguishable but structurally compromised. We are talking about 3.8 million people now living in poverty without a safe roof over their heads or a proper meal. You can see the consequences of this neglect. It's visible on the walls. At least 1/3 of privately rented homes in England do not meet decent living standards. This single statistic transforms 740,000 apartments not into homes, but into domestic traps. They are physical spaces filled with toxic black mold and the persistent risk of carbon monoxide poisoning. The abstract policy decisions made over 4 decades, like right to buy or the systematic pursuit of austerity, have methodically dismantled the social housing fund. This policy choice has pushed millions of the poor into the arms of a specific type of economic actor, the exploitative landlord who profits from this decay. This system, which was supposed to empower, now allows these landlords to pocket an estimated £5.6 billion each year from properties that are by design dilapidated. This is not the evolution of a market. It is the calculated extraction of wealth from poverty, structured and enabled by governance. Is this the full picture of a nation that is collapsing from the very roots of its structure? The physical decay of these communities is just the tangible expression of a profound economic bankruptcy. We will not find the answer in Westminster, but in the places forgotten by it. Let us go to where this transformation is most naked. We must travel to the windy coastline of Jaywick Sands. This village was once the manifestation of a modest dream. Before the devastation of World War II, it was constructed as a quick weekend resort paradise for the working class. You notice the simple chalets still lining the narrow streets. They were built for workers to momentarily smell the sea salt, after inhaling the industrial smoke of the inland factories. But this architectural trap quickly became a social grave. The post-war housing shortage exerted a relentless pressure that turned these makeshift wooden shacks into permanent, year-round residences. You find it hard to reconcile that a country which once pioneered global urban planning, that essentially invented the blueprint for the industrial city, allowed the residents of Jaywick to survive without a standard water supply or an integrated sewage system until the 1980s. For half a century, this village lived with the sanitation infrastructure of the Middle Ages, right in the heart of a supposed superpower. The consequence of this lax land management, executed under the guise of free market deregulation, is now inescapable. Since 2010, the clinical data of the National Indices of Multiple Deprivation tells a stark story. Jaywick is not simply struggling, it has consistently topped the deprivation index, ranking in the bottom 10% of England across every single one of the 7 government poverty metrics. The human toll is visible. Currently, 40% of the residents are medically unable to work, trapped by disabilities or chronic illnesses exacerbated by their environment. Even more significant, 60% of all local primary school students rely entirely on subsidized free meals. This is the definition of generational economic inertia. The predictable consequence of this economic collapse is the implosion of real estate values. The average house price here is a mere £175,636. This is not even half of the £321,936 recorded in neighboring Canvey Island, revealing a spatial poverty trap where asset values can never recover. This collapse, predictably, does not repel investment but attracts a new form of financial parasite. Out-of-town buy-to-let landlords flood the area not to build or maintain, but to exploit. They buy up these cheap plots and rent the deteriorating bungalows for roughly £500 a month. This is not to house. It is to siphon welfare money from the pockets of the poor and, crucially, not spend a single penny on maintenance. and nature is preparing to enforce the final verdict on this failure. All of Jaywick is situated within high-risk flood zone 3. Current climate change projections threaten the village with flooding up to 1.3 meters deep. Those same rotten wooden walls, already saturated with salt and toxic mold, are mathematically preparing to turn into physical coffins. You are left to wonder about a nation that once commanded the world's oceans but now watches helplessly as its own citizens gamble their lives in wooden boxes, waiting for the sea to rise. How could a governance model that prides itself on law and civilization permit an entire village to exist without running water for half a century? And when the tide inevitably rises, will London's budget prioritize reinforcing the sea dikes to save these people? Or will they be conveniently erased from the map, allowing policymakers to finally whitewash their planning mistakes and the uncomfortable reality of Jaywick's existence? This slow, watery decay in Essex is a symptom of a much larger internal erosion. The machine that once produced generational wealth is now systematically manufacturing domestic insolvency. This transformation is not a natural economic migration. It is a structural extraction of capital from the foundations of the state. When we leave the coastal margins of Jaywick and move into the global financial epicenter of London, the scale of this contrast becomes absolute. The conventional framing suggests that extreme wealth inevitably elevates the surrounding community, but the architecture of the capital reveals a parasitic relationship where financialization directly starves the host. We stand in Tower Hamlets, in the direct shadow of Canary Wharf. Here, skyscrapers of glass and steel process global capital flows in fractions of a second, housing hundreds of thousands of high-remuneration corporate roles. Yet directly beneath these billion-dollar towers lies a reality that defies the narrative of modern development. The data shows that 71% of children in Tower Hamlets are trapped in low-income households, a national record of municipal failure. The money glitters at 200 meters in the air, while multi-generational destitution hardens on the pavement below. The structural mechanism behind this polarization is found in the deliberate dismantling of municipal housing assets. The right-to-buy legislation of the 1980s was marketed as democratization, but its systemic consequence was the privatization of public supply. The high-quality housing stock that once anchored working-class families was permanently removed from the public balance sheet and converted into an instrument for private market speculation. Today, the local welfare framework is functionally paralyzed, leaving families with no safety net when private rents escalate beyond the local wage structure. The mathematics of this trap are precise and devastating. The average house price in this district has climbed to an unbridgeable 22 times the average local salary. Private rental costs for a basic flat have outpaced the median gross income of an entire local household, meaning that survival requires sacrificing either nutrition or space. This cost trap has forced an overcrowding crisis that local authorities admit is the most severe recorded since the 1930s. The public queue reflects this structural deficit. Over 30,000 households are currently registered on the waiting list for social housing in Tower Hamlets, while the depleted public fund can only release approximately 1,800 vacant units each year. For a family entering the system today, the statistical reality is a wait measured not in months, but in decades. More than 1,800 of these families are categorized as severely overcrowded, lacking 2 or more required bedrooms. The human consequence of this deficit is the compression of 3 generations into single, poorly ventilated rooms. The persistent moisture and lack of thermal insulation generate dense colonies of black mold spores that line the ceilings and baseboards. This is not merely an aesthetic issue, it is a neurological and respiratory assault. Children growing up in these environments exhibit measurable deficits in cognitive development and chronic respiratory illnesses before they ever enter a primary school classroom. Walk down the residential alleys just 3 blocks from the financial T, rating floors, and the physical reality replaces the abstract data. Here, a long-term resident named Arthur watches the glass towers from a ground floor flat where the windows have been swollen shut by dampness for 4 years. He remembers when these neighborhoods housed dock workers who could afford their rent. Today, he points to a handwritten sign on a neighbor's door, warning visitors to step carefully because the floorboards have rotted through. Arthur's grandchildren sleep on a shared mattress in the kitchen because the main bedroom has become uninhabitable from dampness. their childhoods bounded by the constant hum of a cheap dehumidifier that they can rarely afford to run. This spatial polarization is not a localized anomaly unique to the high-value markets of London. If you trace the path of capital extraction north, you see the exact same structural template applied to different economic landscapes. We move to the traditional working-class sanctuary of Blackpool, where the historical collapse of the domestic tourism model in the 1970s left a massive void of empty guest houses and hotels. Speculative capital did not abandon Blackpool, it repurposed it. Financial actors purchased these large vacant seaside properties at rock-bottom prices, averaging just £111,000 per building, and systematically subdivided them into houses in multiple occupation, or HMOs. This created a highly profitable infrastructure designed specifically to warehouse the vulnerable. Wealthier southern municipal councils quickly recognized an opportunity to manage their own budget deficits by quietly relocating their homeless and benefit-dependent populations to Blackpool, where the supply of cheap, unregulated beds was endless. The result of this institutional displacement is visible in the local census data. Today, 80% of private rental households in the inner core of Blackpool rely entirely on government housing benefits to cover their rent. The landlords who own these properties face no market pressure to maintain or upgrade the structures because their income stream is guaranteed by the state welfare apparatus. The internal mathematics of the HMO model reveal why the decay is intentional. A standard family home in Blackpool commands a modest private rent of roughly £563 per month. However, by partitioning that same property into tiny single-room HMO units and filling them with vulnerable individuals, a landlord can generate between £845 and £1,690 every month from the same footprint. The extraction of triple the standard market rent from the most impoverished tier of society removes any economic incentive to repair the roofs or treat the rising damp. The physical decay has reached a critical threshold across the entire town. Forensic housing surveys confirm that 75% of all private rental properties in Blackpool are significantly corroded by mold, with 25% classified at a level 1 hazard category, meaning they pose an immediate risk to human life. 3/4 of the available rental housing in this town is actively destroying the lung tissue of its occupants. Concurrently, the urban core has reached an energy poverty rate of 27.8%, where households must routinely choose between heating and food. In the winter of 2019 to 2020, data shows that 2.3% of these households had no central heating system whatsoever. The human consequence of this systemic neglect was a recorded 140 excess winter deaths in a single town, where citizens literally froze to death inside properties funded by public welfare vouchers. This pattern of decline is not random, nor is it isolated to seaside towns or capital suburbs. It follows a highly predictable trajectory that is visible wherever public assets have been surrendered to private exploitation and central funding has been withdrawn. The degradation of the physical home is invariably followed by the insolvency of the municipal authority itself, a pattern that becomes terrifyingly clear as we move further east into the industrial heartlands. There is a distinct psychological dissonance at the heart of modern Britain. The structural collapse is entirely visible on the ground, yet it is systematically denied by the official vocabulary of state management. Step outside the municipal offices and the physical evidence is undeniable, yet the bureaucratic apparatus operates on a parallel plane of euphemism. We are told about efficiency drives, resource optimization, and regional rebalancing, while the literal fabric of towns like Middlesbrough, Hartlepool, and Rochdale undergoes a rapid, structural unraveling. The mechanism of this denial relies heavily on a carefully maintained silence and the tactical spinning of clinical data. Consider the public ledger of Middlesbrough. Between 2013 and 2024, the central government executed a flat-rate funding reduction of 46% to the Middlesbrough City Council, shrinking its active operational budget from £81.2 million to a mere £43.5 million without adjusting for the corrosive effects of inflation. Yet, the official narrative framed this fiscal strangulation as an opportunity for local empowerment and streamlined governance. The reality behind the vocabularies is a math equation that leaves no room for actual governance. Middlesbrough, where 31.8% of children reside in absolute poverty, the statutory obligation to protect vulnerable youth and adults consumes up to 83% of the total annual operating budget. The council is forced to spend £54.6 million on children's services and £49.8 million on adult social care, leaving literally nothing for the maintenance of the public realm. The streets go uncleaned, the broken lighting grids are abandoned, and the policing infrastructure operates in a permanent state of triage. To stave off a formal Section 114 bankruptcy notice, the authority was forced to terminate 75 specialist staff, ration waste collection to a bi-weekly schedule, and shutter the historic Captain Cook Museum. This is where the chilling effect takes hold. Local officials and housing officers privately acknowledge that the system is entirely broken, but the institutional culture penalizes candor. Data is aggressively spun to mask the geographical injustice of these cuts. While the industrial North saw an average reduction of 33.3% in actual municipal spending, the significantly wealthier councils in the South faced an average reduction of only 15.2%. To report these figures plainly is to invite political marginalization, so the bureaucracy complies, producing glossy brochures that celebrate minor urban regeneration projects while the surrounding neighborhoods slide into terminal decay. Move further northeast to the coastal town of Hartlepool, and the silence morphs from bureaucratic compliance into a profound, generational paralysis of labor. The grand post-industrial narrative insisted that the closure of the historic shipyards and bustling global ports would be seamlessly mitigated by a transition to a modern service economy. London introduced countless initiatives under the banner of reindustrialization, yet the promised investment capital never materialized in the communities that actually needed it. The hidden cost of this failure is recorded in the 2023 labor data, which reveals an economic inactivity rate in Hartlepool of 29.7%, a record high that drastically outpaces both the regional and national averages. Nearly one-third of the working-age population has been completely excised from the mainstream economy. The true depth of the crisis, however, is hidden within the subsets of that statistic. Among that inactive 30%, a staggering 85% have entirely abandoned the aspiration to find employment. Decades of institutional neglect have narrowed their horizons to the point where they no longer even submit applications. This creates an environment where poverty becomes a hereditary condition. The self-perpetuating mechanism of this economic exclusion means that children raised in these workless households face a 20% to 25% higher risk of long-term structural unemployment when they reach adulthood, with the average weekly wage in the Northeast depressed to £472.30 compared to the national average of £520.70. Those who do find work are still caught in an absolute price storm. The regional energy poverty rate has climbed to 14.7%, transforming historical working-class homes into cold, damp spaces where the basic motivation to participate in society is slowly frozen out when the system does break its silence. It is usually because the structural decay has claimed a human life. In December 2020, a 2-year-old boy named Awab Ishak died in Rochdale, Greater Manchester. The cause of death was not a rare medical condition, but chronic exposure to severe environmental black mold inside a flat managed by Rochdale Borough-wide Housing. The family had filed continuous, formal complaints regarding the structural moisture since 2017, long before the child was ever born. The institutional response to these complaints is a case study in systemic indifference. Rather than allocating capital to repair the building's compromised waterproof membrane and failed ventilation system, the organization instructed the family to simply paint over the toxic growth. When that failed, the bureaucracy weaponized cultural prejudice, blaming the immigrant family's cooking and clothes-drying habits for the mold rather than acknowledging a fundamental construction fault. The silence persisted even after the tragedy. The Housing Association waited nearly 2 years before conducting a comprehensive forensic survey of the remaining apartments in the freehold estate. The delayed results revealed that hundreds of other families were being subjected to the exact same level 1 hazardous mold conditions, their walls saturated and ceilings blackened. While the social housing regulator eventually downgraded the organization to a non-compliant G3 rating, the bureaucratic intervention occurred only after the structural failure had turned fatal. The administrative entities designed to safeguard public health have effectively evolved into insulated corporations that manage public funds while absolving themselves of human accountability. The broader implications of this systemic decay point toward an irreversible spatial polarization across the geography of the nation. In the historic fishing port of Grimsby, the official policy framework of leveling up was deployed with immense political fanfare. Millions of pounds of public money were channeled into refurbishing town squares and constructing polished shopping facades, superficial visual assets designed primarily for political photo opportunities. But this cosmetic intervention deliberately bypassed the foundational needs of the population. The data from the East Marsh district of Grimsby reveals an extreme physical toll. The rate of residents permanently removed from the workforce due to long-term chronic illness has reached 16.17%. Over 16% of the local population is physically deteriorating, their health broken by the direct compounding effects of substandard housing and systemic food insecurity. Newly built middle-class housing developments sit in sharp geometric contrast to the rotting social housing stock across the street, creating a volatile landscape where the wealthy and the completely disenfranchised share the same zip code but occupy entirely different centuries. This disruption of the baseline social contract is deeply visible in Liverpool, where the legacy of the Housing Market Renewal Initiative systematically demolished cohesive working-class brick neighborhoods in the name of modernization, only to leave the land abandoned when private capital retreated. This policy of forced displacement has given rise to massive urban food deserts. The Liverpool metropolitan area now contains half of the 10 most severe food deserts in England, where populations of up to 15,000 people have zero localized access to fresh, affordable nutrition. The direct result is an artificial modern famine. In 2025, the hunger relief data for the Liverpool City region recorded a historic 206,845 emergency food bank referrals. More than 200,000 people in a single metropolitan area are dependent on charitable infrastructure just to avoid physical collapse. When you analyze the demographics of those queuing for food assistance, the structural cruelty is laid bare. Disabled individuals constitute 69% of the recipients, while 46% reside in social housing and 22% rent from the private market. In a G7 nation, the state has effectively outsourced the most basic biological survival of its most vulnerable citizens to spontaneous, underfunded charities. This financial and structural insolvency reached its logical conclusion in September 2024, when Birmingham, the second largest city in the United Kingdom, officially issued a Section 114 notice declaring municipal bankruptcy. The crisis was driven by an unmanageable combination of systemic underfunding, catastrophic IT infrastructure failures, and an outstanding £760 million equal pay liability. Faced with a localized budget deficit of £300 million, the administrators implemented a regime of unprecedented fiscal extraction from the citizenry. The council tax ceiling was immediately raised by 9.99% for the fiscal year 2025 to 2026. While the state initiated a rapid liquidation of heritage assets, selling off more than £750 million worth of public land, historical libraries, and community spaces. As public services were stripped to the absolute bone, a severe waste crisis emerged. Prolonged sanitation strikes turned the low-income corridors of Birmingham into vast open-air dumps where toxic illegal waste accumulated on the doorsteps of the poor. By 2026, the city had technically emerged from the formal bankruptcy protocol, but only by submitting to a permanent, unelected surveillance apparatus of central government commissioners. The final trajectory of this decay is etched into the geography of the Merthyr Tydfil Valley in South Wales. This historic engine room of the industrial empire now faces an absolute medical emergency, rooted entirely in the built environment. Clinical data shows that 30% of the entire population is significantly restricted in daily activities due to chronic illnesses, far outstripping the already elevated Welsh average of 23.3%. Simultaneously, 8.61% of the working-age population has been permanently driven out of the labor market by illness. The Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation confirms that 81% of the small areas within this valley fall directly into the poorest half of the nation. The biological loop is absolute. The damp, cold geography of the valley combines with old, poorly insulated housing stock to systematically induce chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and severe asthma. The resulting loss of health strips the individual of labor capacity, driving down household income. The median weekly wage here is just £376, and ensuring the family can never afford to remediate the property. The home ceases to be a shelter and becomes a biological prison. Yet, the bureaucratic machinery remains entirely indifferent. Field investigations reveal that 34% of terminally ill residents in these impoverished neighborhoods are completely blocked from accessing essential disability medical benefits by a dense wall of complex administrative clauses and deliberate procedural delays. The state apparatus has systematically detached itself from the human suffering it was created to alleviate. What we are looking at across the length of this geography is not a series of disconnected municipal failures, but the absolute structural bankruptcy of an entire economic model. When a global superpower permits millions of its citizens to fall into deep destitution, allows its children to be stifled by toxic housing, and forces its disabled populations to queue on the street for basic nutrition, it has failed the fundamental test of a developed civilization. The wealth concentrated in the financial centers can no longer obscure the physical, rotting reality of the periphery, as the sea levels rise against the fragile, wooden chalets of Jaywick and the stinking garbage piles high in the streets of Birmingham. The question is no longer whether the system can be reformed, but rather what happens to a society when the basic architecture of human dignity is permanently stripped away. Who will bear the ultimate cost when the thin veneer of 21st century stability finally splits wide open and the modern world is forced to look directly into the face of its own manufactured ruins?